What's up guys, JayzTwoCents here and welcome back to my home office where I'm creating videos once again because we are practicing social distancing as best as possible and staying the F home as long as we possibly can. So yeah, once we do return to the studio, we'll do everything we can to be responsible, but it's not too hard to keep distance from Phil, or should I say for him to keep distance from me, because I fart a lot and no one likes to be near me when I'm like that anyway. So it won't be hard. Anyway, moving on, a long time ago, by a long time ago, I mean last year, which is an eternity in YouTube time, I built Nebula. And I told you guys I would kind of talk to you about that build and why I went some of the directions that I did and what the performance is like, and I never followed up on that. Because truth be told, after it was done, I started getting really into small form factor stuff, cue the Star Wars build that I did, and I started losing interest in these giant 100-pound plus computers. But I'm kind of glad I stuck around with it. So let's talk about some of the things about this computer that I like, some of the things that I don't like, and maybe some things for you guys to think about when you're doing your builds, when you see something as pretty as this, but that has a massive amount of diminishing returns and a lot of wasted money when it comes to practicality. Today's video is sponsored by the Corsair One Pro i200 compact workstation PC. Powered by the Intel Core i9-10940X 14-core CPU and NVIDIA 2080 Ti video card, the i200 is the best of both worlds when it comes to water-cooled, small form factor PCs for both work and play. To learn more about this tiny but powerful professional-grade PC, follow the link in the description below. So Nebula was designed to be a Skunkworks replacement. I had Skunkworks for a long time, and that was my gunmetal SMA8 case, the Case Labs case that had several revisions in it. It was the first system I had done rigid tubing in, and it sort of evolved over time. It started with an, Z97 was the first build I had in there. It was a Devil's Canyon 4790K, and then from there I went to X99, and then X299, and it had three-way SLI for the longest time, when it still actually worked, and that was only practical because of the fact that for a while there I was using 3 screens, and you could actually have 3 monitors plugged into 3 different GPUs at the time. It took a lot of the load off of it. There were different ways to do NV Surround, but this isn't about that. But over time I basically was like, well, the idea behind Skunkworks was it was the centerpiece of the channel, and considering I had that PC for, well, its iterations and such for about 5 years, actually a little bit over 5 years I think, it got to the point to where I got tired of looking at the same tower over and over and over again. And don't get me wrong, I love Case Labs. I F in chat for Case Labs, but although they may be the most functional cases in terms of size and modularity and all that, they're not the prettiest things to look at. They're just big rectangles made out of CNC machined pieces of sheet metal, and they're aluminum, and they're bent on press brakes, and they had very industrial looks to them. But that wasn't gonna fly in this space. And one of the things I always said I was gonna do was when I redid my office space, I wanted centerpieces, and it was supposed to be the BFGD monitor. We already talked about that and why I changed my decision on that, and a new tower for the centerpiece. And that's where Nebula comes in. But one of the things that happens is, because I'm mostly a one-man operation, and what I mean by that, and that's not taking anything away from Phil. He does all the editing, he does a lot of the B-roll. I still shoot a lot of the B-roll. I do all of the planning, I do all of the building, I do all of the content creation in terms of the ideas. Multiple projects going at the same time. I've got obligations with vendors and stuff to do ads and projects for them and stuff. So my stuff tends to always take a long time, if you guys haven't noticed. I mean, everyone loves to give me a hard time about how long the celebrity builds have taken, but whatever, it is what it is. So as you probably know, if you're a professional that does anything, if you do automotive work or whatever, your projects usually take a backseat to everyone else's. So it's one of those things where once Nebula was done, I was already kind of over it. But then once I started building the office, I got to the point where I'm like, okay, this build looks phenomenal. It's brushed aluminum, it's polished chamfered edges, the glass everywhere. And I knew that this build had to be something different. And for me, it was the first time using all metal tubing. I got Alpha Cool tubing that was 13 millimeter outer diameter. It came in different lengths. I had pre-bent 90s already, that way I could use fittings where I didn't have 90s, and then I didn't have to worry about trying to bend it. In fact, once it was already nickel plated, you can't bend it. If you bend it again, you're just gonna crack all the nickel plating. It's not flexible. So I did the best I could with, oh, my TV just turned off. Yeah, in terms of lighting in here, guys, bear with me. I have literally no lights in this room. So what that means is you're seeing me lit entirely by the ambient lighting. and it is raining really bad today, which means no sunlight. I think it's okay. We're using the A7S, which is great in low light. Anyway, moving on. Working with the metal tubes was probably the second most annoying way of building a water-cooled PC that I've personally done, and first place being only glass. I mean, glass tubing is, when you don't have all the proper tools to cut glass and re-strengthen it and such. Fortunately, I haven't had any tubes break on me so far, but of the builds that I've done with glass, those are the most pain in the ass. But metal is definitely a close second place. Now, although it's easier to cut metal tubes with them being already plated like they are, they're nickel-plated brass tubes, which makes them, one, very, very heavy, so trying to avoid sag and such when it comes to the different bends. You can see from the GPUs, I've got 90-degree fittings out, 90-degree up, and then 90-degree back into the back firewall area. We'll call the motherboard tray the firewall. I'm very automotive around here. The amount of weight that there is alone with just the fittings in a normal build, adding the weight of brass tubing made it that much more of a kind of a pain in the butt to try and keep things from sagging and keep everything aligned the way it's supposed to be. The other thing being dimensions. So one of the things I did with this build is I used plastic tubing, or PETG, and I mocked up all the lengths that I needed. I bent the 90s to match the radius of the metal tubing, and I did the full loop in plastic. I then took those plastic pieces and used them as a template for cutting the metal pieces. But one of the things that happens is, even though you mark it as best you can, 1 millimeter difference in length at the short end is a lot on the far end. So it's kind of like that old adage of, oh yeah, you know, you only might be off by 1/2 degree on the compass, but in 1,000 miles, how far away is that 1,000 degrees over distance, right? So this isn't 1,000 miles or 1,000 whatever, I think I said 1,000 degrees, you know what I mean? So the same thing can happen with this. So if you have everything lining up perfectly with plastic, and let's say you've got tubes that are varying by 1 millimeter or 2 per tube, nothing lines up again perfectly. So trimming a very, very short amount of tubing without having like a miter saw with a metal blade, or one that's small enough to be able to just trim the very edge off of a tube. You can't do that with a pipe cutter like I was using, which is the clamp-on type that you turn around and it cuts the pipe. I feel like it would have been a lot easier even having a cheap little saw like Paul was using for his PETG cutting with a proper metal cutting blade on there, because even trying to use a Dremel, it's impossible to get it straight. It's always going to be at an angle or something crazy like that, and not to mention the amount of blades you would go through would make it just completely unpractical when it comes to the amount of work it's going to take. So my suggestion to those that are interested in doing metal tubing would be have some sort of a saw, a proper cutting saw for small diameter tubing to be able to make short trims. And then you have, that's the other thing too, is after you cut the metal, it's very sharp. It's going to have burrs. It's, no matter what, it's not going to be perfect. So even if you take a file and you file the edges like you can normally do with an exhaust system, they just kind of rotate it on the edge of on the side of the blade, and okay, it's smoothed up now, good enough, go weld it. You can't do that with this tubing. This tubing is very, very sharp, even if you start to file it. So you've got to do like I was doing, the straight pieces, chuck it up in a drill, sort of spin it, hold a file against it, and make it more rounded, because inside the fittings, especially the AlphaCool fittings that we were using that was designed specifically to clamp onto soft or smooth metal tubing like the nickel-plated brass tube, has O-rings inside of it. And so you're going to easily slice the O-rings. You slice the O-rings, you slice the seal. And although there are multiple O-rings in there, so cutting one wouldn't necessarily make it leak, it's not doing yourself any favors by having sliced O-rings. And I don't think with a system that you're going to spend the kind of money on for metal tubing, that's the sort of thing that you're willing to take a risk with. The other thing that I really started second guessing myself with Nebula was SLI. We know SLI is pretty much dead in gaming. When Tom A. Peterson left NVIDIA, with it sort of went the vision for SLI. That was his thing. He loved SLI, he wanted to keep it alive, he really wanted to promote it. And after Pascal, it was obvious, well, with the Pascal launch, that things were changing, because they didn't even want to talk about more than 2 graphics cards in SLI, and then having 3 and 4, although doable with the 1080 Ti, was one of those things, like in the beginning, if you remember, they were going to have to give you like a special code to unlock it on your system, and it was just a complete hassle in trying to figure out what was happening with that. Fast forward to 2080 Ti, you can't even go past 2A if you wanted, and then 2A is pretty much useless in anything other than benchmarking and or rendering PCs / streaming PCs. So one of the reasons why I ended up sticking with Nebula is I've got 2 2080 Ti EVGA For the Win 3 graphics cards in there. They're custom PCBs, they're gigantic, they're designed for overclocking, although I'm not overclocking them that far right now, and we'll talk about why in a second. These are the cards we used when we started kind of ramping up our competition against Steve with the overclocking beef battles. And these have the secret sauce BIOS on them, which allowed me to go 200% power draw. In this config, that would never happen because of the fact that the amount of heat that those cards can generate and just using standard water cooling with ambient air is not gonna work. In fact, those cards only saw chilled water with ice, which kept them down to around 20, 22 C under load, which in their current config, they stay closer to 52, 55 under load, which is funny because the air cooler with the fan set to 100% can get nearly as cold. So that's kind of bringing me on to the next thing with Nebula that kind of irritated me was the cooling of it. Now, although I do have two 420 millimeter radiators up top that are 45 millimeters thick, it's less radiator than I wanted for this system. I would have loved to have had two 420 radiators just for the graphics cards. Now, in terms of the CPU, I'm running a 9980XE. And if you remember when I had this dilemma whether or not I wanted to use the 9980 or the new 10980XE, I was torn because the 9980 is the CPU that we held the record with until the 3175X came out. And so this CPU had nostalgia. But one of the things that I significantly underestimated was the amount of cooling it's truly gonna need. In fact, that should also have its very own 420 or 480 millimeter radiator. That CPU, in my experience with it, was only used under dry ice and liquid nitrogen. I never ran it with a basic water cooler, even one that wasn't one that was just water chilled with ice. Just using regular water with it, this sucker gets hot. Now, I had to spend a lot of time tuning the voltage on this because pushing the overclock like it is right now to only 4.6 gigahertz. Now remember, I ran it at 5.1 gigahertz, I believe, on, no, we got almost 6 gigahertz out of this guy. I remember this now. We got like 5.8, 5.9 gigahertz out of it on dry ice and liquid nitrogen. I'm running it at 4.6, 4.7 on water and dealing with massive, massive heat. As you might expect, it's an 18-core processor, so it has a lot of focused heat in there. So when it comes to just normal water cooling, the best cooling you could possibly hope for is ambient. And without it being chilled, it means that it's never going to get to ambient with the amount of radiators that I have in there. So an 18-core 9980XE and two 2080 Ti for the Win 3 graphics cards from EVGA with special BIOS that I procured on there, making a lot of heat is asking an awful lot of two 420 millimeter radiators. Now the next thing too is, like I talked about the heat with the 9980XE, I had to do a massive amount of voltage tuning on there to get it so that when I would run Cinebench R20, it would not immediately go to 110C, which is where it was going. And now remember, this is a lapped CPU with water that would instantaneously go to 110C with the AVX instruction offset turned to 0, so it would stay at its full turbo clocks. Funny enough though, it didn't throttle, which it should have done at 105. And I made sure all the settings on my Rampage Extreme, I can't remember which one this is. It's above the Rampage Extreme, it's the next one. I forget what it's called, but anyway, I digress. I made sure that the feature of automatically thermal limit is on, and it was, and it went to 110 and didn't throttle. So I was starting to get a little concerned that something was wrong with my mount. No, it was just pumping 1.4 volts to 18 cores, which then made me go, was this a mistake? So when I built the Star Wars system for DreamHack, and we upgraded that, remember it's got a 9900K in there, it's got a Titan RTX, it's got a single fan with two very small AIOs for each part. It never got over 50C on the GPU. The CPU never got anywhere above over 80C. I live streamed all weekend long, playing on the system that I was live streaming from, using the NVENC encoder or the NVIDIA encoder on the Titan while gaming at 1440p while live streaming, and never saw any lag. I never saw any sort of drop frames, and you would have never known that you were live streaming on the same machine that you were playing on. Back in the day, just a few years back, if you hit go live on a machine and then started playing games, you would notice some stutter. You would definitely notice a reduction in frames per second because of the CPU and GPU overhead for live streaming. And it was not a great thing, which is why streaming PCs became a thing. So after DreamHack, I went, was this a bad idea? Was this stupid? Is Nebula stupid? Yes, she is. There's no need for a system like that. There's so much impracticality in that system. I could have, and I even considered, and Phil will attest to this, I had a hard time trying to decide whether or not to just bring the Star Wars system over here, disassemble Nebula, put those parts back in inventory, and build something else out of it. But then I thought that's not the Jay way. We need to go big and oversized like me and just have a system that makes a statement, which is what it is. So fortunately, after doing a lot of the voltage tuning and bringing the voltage down, because the auto voltage was putting way more voltage than it needed to run at the speeds that I was running it at, got the temperatures very stable. Under Cinebench now, it hits about 88 C, and if you guys know anything about AVX offsets or AVX instructions, that's a very intensive load under a very short amount of time. It now sits about 88 C. When I'm gaming, it sits in the 40s or 50s. My graphics cards will get to about 55 C when I run an SLI benchmark like Heaven or 3D Mark or something like that. When I'm gaming, only one card does anything, and it doesn't have a hard time pushing this 3860 by 1600 monitor. Is it 3840? 3860? The QHD, right? The WQHD panel. It has no problems pushing that panel with a single card. The second card pretty much only handles rendering and live streaming and such. And I'm glad I stuck with it because I think most would agree in this setup, it certainly fits the build for what I wanted. So I just kind of want to give you guys a little bit of an update. And is this a whole Jay's running out of content ideas? Yeah, a little bit. I don't have a whole lot here to make videos about, and I'm trying to avoid going outside and going to the other studio and grabbing things. We do have some reviews coming up this month, so you're gonna see some stuff. And then also too, like I said, we are gonna return back to the studio because of some of those launches and things that we have to handle, but we'll do the best we can to stay responsible. So guys, what are you doing during this downtime? During all of this quarantine and chill, what is your favorite way to pass the time? And please keep it clean. I know there's some ways that you guys could probably pass the time that involves lotion and chafing, and I don't want to hear about that. So keep that one to yourself. Anyway guys, thanks for watching. Just wanted to kind of give you an update on how this system has been. Many of you asked if Nebula was living up to my expectations. And yes, after a lot of tuning. And this is not a system that I think would have been very newbie friendly. If you built this for the first time and you do your first benchmark, you would be like, oh my God, what the hell? This thing is overheating. And you probably wouldn't have known where to start. And it even frustrated me as a power user and someone that's built hundreds of systems and has dealt with a lot of problems in the past. This one was just frustrating in the sense of the amount of micro tuning that it needed. So if you guys want to know more about what I did to reduce the temperatures without reducing the performance, then I suggest you sound off in the comments below and let me know, and I'll make that video. Anyway guys, thanks for watching. Hope you're staying safe. Hope you guys are feeling well. And as always, I will see you in the next one.